Why, hello there, Mentioners. I'm Joel Furchess, and this is Mentionables TV. Today, on Mentionables TV, we're going to be taking a look at a video posted by atheist vlogger and artist, Dark Matter 2525. Let's take a look at what he has to say in this video from Dark Matter 2525.
Who are the most iconic villains in film and literature? Professor Moriarty, Hannibal Lecter, Child's Play. They're not responsible for that much death. What about Dracula? What about the Joker? Now we're getting a little more dangerous because they actually affected entire regions of people. How about Sauron or Darth Vader? Now we're getting serious. They marched armies and destroyed worlds. Vader even went full space Nazi and helped rule over an entire galaxy. King of all villains, though, would have to be Thanos, who wanted to kill half of all life in the universe, people chosen at random, as he said, dispassionate, rich and poor alike, in a Malthusian effort to bring the universe into balance. Who could possibly compete with such destruction of life?
At this point, I'd like to offer a spoiler alert. He's going to say that God is worse than Thanos. Now, on a purely rhetorical level, I'm going to have to take issue with that. What are the common accusations against God? That he flooded the world and killed the relatively small antediluvian population? That he rained fire down on the small cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? That he commanded genocide of the Amalekites? In terms of pure destruction of life, Thanos' destruction of half of all life in the universe still has God beat. In a universe as populated as the Marvel Universe, we're talking about quintillions of lives. In terms of motivation, Thanos' motivation was to save life by taking life. Sort of like, in order to save a village, you have to destroy that village. Not particularly well thought out. But let's give him points for trying. Without getting deep into God's motivation, put simply, it is justice. When humans are killing and raping and victimizing and destroying, they deserve punishment. Even if we agree on that in the modern justice system, perhaps the greatest point of disagreement may be that death penalty is a little harsh of a punishment. But it's worth it noting that, in the Bible stories, God gave ample warning prior to all of the punishment we've mentioned. This is not an argument that these Bible stories are moral in the best sense of the word. That's a different argument to take up. What I'm saying is that, for God to be the worst villain, he'd have to step up his pace a little bit to meet Thanos' standard.
What's funny about one villain that could be worse than Thanos is that he wasn't written as a villain, and he is worshipped by billions of people around the world, including Christians, Jews, and Muslims. He is Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, the God of Abraham, who shares the same origin story across all three religions, from Moses to Jesus and eventually to Muhammad. Isn't it ridiculous to call a beloved character a villain, though? No, not really. Several of the villains I already mentioned are well-liked, too. Hannibal Lecter's calculating psychopathy is eventually used against other antagonists in cathartic ways. The Joker is funny and interesting, stands by his principles, and often makes insightful criticisms of society. Thanos, though ruthless, has integrity. He lives by the standard he sets for others. Thanos is not simply motivated by hate, and he shows respect and admiration for the people who resist him. Even a disliked villain's brutality can be seen as a redeeming quality, as when the...
Now let's accept, for the sake of argument, that God is a fictional character from several pieces of literature. People argue over whether Thanos is a villain, since he was sacrificing half of the universe to save all of the universe. On the other hand, the Thanos of the comic books wasn't trying to save the universe when he wiped out all of those lives. He was trying to impress a girl. So depending on which version of Thanos you're referencing, you're going to have to make a very different argument. The same might be said of various versions of Joker, from movies to cartoons to comics, or of Hannibal Lecter from shows to movies to novels, and of Darth Vader from movies to shows to comics. In fact, there's a comic wherein Darth Vader reforms and joins the rebels. Likewise, people are going to try to argue that God perhaps wasn't the villain, but you've introduced a problem from the outset. Orthodox Jews are going to have a different argument against God's villainy than Muslims, and Muslims are going to have different arguments than Christians. If we're going to treat God as a fictional character, it's uncouth to lump three versions of God together as if they have identical motivations and natures and backgrounds and stories. At least be consistent in the arguments that you're making.
Makes God so powerful as a villain is not his omnipotence, which is ironically his greatest weakness, but rather that he literally is us.
Okay, so what we're talking about here is the so-called omnipotence paradox. This is famously demonstrated in the question, can God make a rock bigger than he can lift? Others might be, could God make another God equal to himself, or could God commit suicide? The point being that if God can do anything, then he becomes contradictory because he becomes his own obstacle. The simple answer to this question is that saying God can do anything is a little too simplistic. The truth of the matter is that God can do anything that is logically possible. So could God make a married bachelor? No, because these words don't belong in the same sentence. It's a nonsense question. God make a square circle? No, because that isn't a thing. It's like asking, could God biddly boop? It's pure nonsense. God can't do things that are contradictory because he doesn't contradict. If he could do things that were contradictory, then yeah, he could make a rock bigger than he could lift. And then if he wanted to, he could lift it.
It can certainly be compelling to point out atrocities in the Bible committed or commanded by God. One problem with that approach is when apologists can't come up with a satisfactory excuse, they appeal to our ignorance as limited human beings, so no matter what, they always have a trump card. If I point out how God killed all the firstborn in Egypt, or demanded the deaths of Midianite babies, or even flooded the entire earth, killing children and animals alike, it won't really matter to some people. In these stories, the blameless consistently pay the ultimate price for the guilty, which is not only a theme we repeatedly see in the Bible, but is also a hallmark of terrorism. These actions are typically found within the realm of supervillains, yet they are seen as acceptable.
So here he's judging God by a standard that he's importing upon the text. But where is he getting this standard from? God is bad, right? What makes God bad? Well, he judges Israel's enemies, right? Special note, he actually spends more time judging Israel than various Bible heroes than he does the enemies. Anyone judging and killing and so forth are wrong. Why are they wrong? Because they are. This very idea that some things are actually objectively wrong, whereas others are actually objectively right, is a standard we must impose when separating heroes from villains, then there has to be some kind of metaphysical grounding for right and wrong. With no such grounding, the God of the Bible is good because I say he's good. But in order to ground goodness and badness, you need some kind of immaterial, personal, and universal mind capable of lending value to things. So you would need some kind of God in order to attack the biblical God. So he talks about this appeal to ignorance. And this is technically called skeptical theism. The basic concept here is that we, in our limited knowledge, cannot show that God might not have good reasons for acting or refraining to act in a particular way. It is essentially the idea of the butterfly effect. A greater good might be gained by an immediate tragedy. Now, logically and philosophically, there's nothing wrong with the concept of skeptical theism. But, as 2525 does here, it doesn't seem to meet the outrage and emotion that accompany these particular accounts. In fact, I saw an atheist philosopher saying that you could defeat skeptical theism by just showing as many terrible things that happen as you possibly can, and at some point you say that, well, there could be no good reason for all of these things because there's too many of them. But this doesn't make logical or philosophical sense if we don't know the ends. Now, there's a few more things that should be said here. Firstly, 2525 and atheists in general don't see these accounts as being historically true. And if they didn't happen, then this isn't an argument against God, simply against the accuracy of the Bible. On the other hand, if they did happen, then God exists and just isn't particularly likable. But I have no obligation to defend the likability of God. The accounts themselves are internally consistent. A few things. Everyone dies. And God, being all-powerful, could be said to be the one who allows everyone to die. But notice that you never see atheists object to the fact of death, merely particular instances of death. In the long run, God fixes the problem of death through the work of Jesus. But what about these particular instances of death, where God seems to either cause or command the deaths? Notice that 2525 consistently points out specific accounts of children dying. You can only assume that he does this to escape what might be called the problem of karmic retribution, meaning adults might arguably deserve death sometimes because of bad things they've done, but children are presumably innocent due to the immaturity and their reliance on adults. Again, everyone dies, and God doesn't stop it, so this isn't the objection. It's because God obviously caused it, and it happened to innocents. Now, this may be upsetting, but it isn't a silver bullet. Skeptical theism aside, if we allow for the possibility of a desirable and suffering-free afterlife, this isn't an intractable problem. And if we allow that some greater good might be achieved via the butterfly effect, then it isn't morally intractable. This is an example of what I call the creator versus intruder conundrum. If one assumes that God is the creator of the universe and all life within it, then all things exist for him, according to him and for his purposes. God gave life. He is permitted to take life, and he can and will restore life. On the other hand, if we came into being apart from God and we live to determine our own purposes, then anything God does to us without our approval is consent to evil. Evil. And yes, the goodness and badness of this entirely depends on who controls the narrative. It's 2525's time to control the narrative, and to him, God is definitely the intruder in the story.
The people who invented God wrote him to be the good guy who would destroy their enemies or even justify their own atrocities, which is why a supposedly spaceless and timeless being was so wrapped up in a culture of a particular place at a particular.
So to his point, it's worth noting that the story arc of the Bible starts with a universal concern for all nations. When that fails, God selects a single individual, tells this individual that through his progeny, the world will be blessed. Again, right from the beginning, the concern is the eventual blessing of all nations. From this one individual, God creates a nation. But throughout the story, there's always a single heir who is selected to carry on the legacy while all of the others fall away. Generation after generation pass, with so many heirs rejected and always a single one accepted. And it's worth noting that the one selected was always countercultural. God always seems to select the youngest and often weakest heir, who somehow manages to transform to greatness. Again, this is not how an ancient Near East culture would write their story. They're interested in shame and honor, and it would always be the most honorable heir who would be selected, not the weakest, not the youngest. When the actual hero of this story emerges, you can trace his bloodline back to the very beginning of the story. So this constant focus on individuals has a very story-centric purpose on ushering in the hero of the tale. Then what does the hero do? He instructs his followers to spread out across the world and make every nation his disciples. This again is a twist from the original flow of the story, wherein it was focused on individuals and one nation. Now it's a focus on all nations, fulfilling the prophecy that through this legacy, all of the world would be blessed. So after the climax of the story, it is no longer a single people or individual upon which the story is focused. It broadens the scope out to the entire world.
The colloquial version of this response is God works in mysterious ways.
Okay, I'm going to have to jump in and respond briefly to this. I honestly only ever hear atheists say God works in mysterious ways, as a parody of the Christian attitude. I can't remember the last time I heard a Christian say it. It isn't in the Bible. The phrase originally comes from a mediocre song that someone wrote.
Considered, all we truly need to do is ask one simple Machiavellian question: does the end justify the means? When the apologists...
Okay, I'm going to have to jump in here. This is a broad misunderstanding of the nature of the Bible's story arc. Before I go into this, let's point out a fundamental assumption that permeates all such arguments. The assumption is that the story revolves around me, that my comfort and my benefit is the greatest end toward which the story must flow, and that if I'm not pleased by what happens to me and to others, then God is the villain. This sort of harkens back to the creator versus intruder dilemma. If we proceed with the assumption that my good is the greatest good, then yes, there's no satisfactory answer to this problem. You might lose out in this story, and if the story is about you, then God is probably the villain of the piece. The fact of the matter is that the story revolves around God, if, that is, God exists. The irony is that this argument from Outrage really only makes sense if these stories are true. For the argument to stick, the stories have to be true. If the story isn't true, it's a pointless argument. So it's ultimately self-defeating. If God precedes creation, then everything within it must have some ends towards which it was designed. A necessary God is the necessary source of all great-making properties. By creating free will creatures external to himself, God makes a scenario in which he may exercise his properties. God is just because he brings justice. He is good because he defeats evil. He is loving because he loves, wise because he acts with wisdom, powerful because he creates, and so forth. But there is a paradox with all of this. If God must punish evil, but he must also be loving and forgiving, then he is in conflict with himself. Or so it would seem. Here's where Jesus comes into play. Jesus takes on God's wrath, which satisfies his need for justice. And because God's wrath has been satisfied, he is able to love and forgive. The paradox is resolved, and now it comes down to individual humans. A human who asks forgiveness becomes a vessel through which God's great love and forgiveness has been exercised. A human who turns his or her back on God becomes a vessel through which God's punishment of evil is displayed. This gives each individual person value in the story, because whatever their ultimate fate, the individual has played a part in defining and revealing ultimate reality, which is God. This echoes through eternity, making each individual eternally valuable. Now, from the intruder perspective, this is unforgivable. A truly good God should allow individuals to run around doing whatever they please without interference. And if the person is generally good and doesn't commit any egregious evils, but isn't keen on loving God, why do they deserve any kind of punishment? If one's perspective is that God is the intruder in the story, and the story is about me and my desired ends, then yes, God is the villain for sweeping in from the outside and imposing himself upon me.
Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. This makes it clear beyond the shadow of any doubt that the end does not justify the means. Where Thanos wipes out half of everyone, God wipes out the vast majority. Thanos, an obvious supervillain, is actually far less destructive than the God of the Bible. Not only did God tie everyone to the track, but he's pulling the lever to kill 5 people in order to save 1. He's taking the action that everyone can agree is immoral. Not only does this immoral choice taint God, but it also taints the believers, because the majority of people will not be saved, and God knows that before those people even existed. Then the purpose for their existence, knowingly doomed, must be to facilitate the people who will be saved. So, if Christianity were true, as a non-Christian, my purpose and the purpose of billions of other people is to be sacrificed so that Christians can get into heaven. Unlike Jesus, we don't come back to life.
This doesn't follow. I can't even see how a non-believer's sacrifice would serve to get a believer into heaven. Jesus' sacrifice, yes. But if every single individual accepted that sacrifice, they could presumably get into heaven without any non-believers necessary.
Immoral to accept that the majority must be sacrificed just to save your own skin. It would be.
But by what standard? How do you prove this? If humans are just walking hunks of organized matter, what gives them the kind of worth necessary to uphold your premise? Where is that worth grounded? How do you show that individual lives are worthy of being saved? We all agree that they are, but at the very least, I have a grounding for that belief. Where does your grounding lie?
Now, imagine that you've never even seen Thanos, and an anonymous person merely told you all that stuff in the Marvel movies was true. Would you still swear allegiance to Thanos and accept him and his plan to commit mass genocide just to save your own skin? If so, you probably aren't a very moral person. The apology...
Okay, I don't follow that. At worst, you're a very credulous person. But naivety isn't evil according to any standard that I know. He's most likely hearkening back to an earlier point, that a person tends to ally themselves to a cause and then attack everyone outside of that cause. But notice that his characterization of God in this context runs counter to the biblical narrative. As we've mentioned before, the Bible concludes with the injunctive to go forth and preach the gospel to all people. At no point did Thanos try to recruit anyone. On the other hand, the Christian mission has been remarkably successful. 1/3 of the world are Christians. That's 1 in 3 people. The biblical claim is that Jesus took on our shame and we took on his honor. What we see in Scripture is the opposite of the Thanos narrative. We have a God on a mission to save as many doomed people as is possible. Besides of which, the Thanos and the Christian narrative are beyond comparison. In the Thanos narrative, you have a villain that wants to expend souls in the pursuit of gems. In the Christian narrative, you have people who are told to give up their fortunes in pursuit of souls. So, the most precious thing in the Christian narrative is other people. And you see this in how people have pursued the Christian mission. The world is covered with hospitals and schools that are built as part of the Christian mission. There's not a single other religion out there that has done so much to assist and help the building of the world than Christianity. So this portrait of God as a villain does not accurately depict God. At worst, God has a clincher on the afterlife, but in this life, Christians are compelled to visit the widows and to help the orphans and to follow all of these narratives of love and assistance to the world that one doesn't find anywhere outside of that narrative. So, to compare God to a supervillain doesn't really do God justice in the good that Christianity has done for the world, whether or not it's true.
God is omniscient. If God is beyond time, then he sees the end at the beginning, and it's God's choice to create a universe that leads to a particular outcome. That would not affect our free will. If God wanted a world in which most people are saved, he could have created a world more conducive to saving most people, perhaps with more convincing evidence to compel more people.
If God is beyond time, then he doesn't just see the end and the beginning. He is equally active in both the end and the beginning simultaneously. If he sees what's coming, that would mean he can see ahead like a fortune teller, but otherwise he will be trapped in time with the rest of us, having to do what he sees that he's going to do in the future. If, on the other hand, God is above space and time, you might say that God acts once, and that action covers every moment in time, whereas humans can only see the past and the present. This is what allows humans to have a free will experience. They act on information from the past, in the present, creating future outcomes. Meanwhile, God is acting simultaneously at every step of the way. This is how God can be timeless and humans can still have free will. God doesn't foresee the future. He is just acting and reacting to every human decision simultaneously at every moment in time. In a way, this argues the necessity of certain outcomes. As God is creating the world, He is simultaneously dealing with all of the decisions each individual makes across time and space, and the choices they will make, and the separate outcomes of those choices. And God is acting at every moment with the knowledge of every other moment. If you follow this reasoning, it doesn't argue that God sat at the beginning of time, looking forward and seeing what everyone was going to do, and make his decisions based on what he saw coming down the line. Creation is an eternal act of God. There is never a time He didn't create, because there was no time outside of creation. And so, from God's perspective, creation was a holistic act, and the consequences of each moment of creation were simultaneous. So this cuts down on this idea that God can have no free will because He sees what's coming, what He's going to do in the future, and so He has to do what He sees coming down the line. And it also argues against this idea that God could have created a different universe and things could have been different than they are, because the decision to create the universe and every moment in the universe was determined at once, and people's decisions were a consequence of the universe that He created. It's a necessary universe for the consequence of creation, and it allows for free will, both of God and of man, and the outcomes that come from that.
In other words, instead of creating a narrow path to life and a wide path to destruction, He could have done the inverse. In a burning building, is it the hero or the villain who makes it more difficult for people to get through the doors?
Now you'd think that the hero is the one who runs in and sacrifices his life to save as many people as he possibly can from the fire. Just saying. Now, of course, the counter-argument will be, if God can do anything, why couldn't He save them all? Here we run up against the "if God can do anything" question again. And, as we've already learned, it isn't logically possible to save them all. God has exercised His free will in such a way that the maximum number of people that can be saved are saved.
Likewise, I cannot simply choose to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, no matter how much I am threatened or promised reward.
This is another atheist trope that the only reason that Christians have to follow the God are rewards or threats. To paraphrase my friend J. Warner Wallace, I don't believe Christianity because I want to. I believe it because it's true. The entire argument here is I'm not convinced because I don't like the consequences of the belief. Not liking something doesn't make it untrue. I'm certain 2525 would say the same thing if I told him I didn't want to be an atheist because I didn't like the way it feels.
Human beings have wildly different capabilities. Some of us can run marathons, while others can barely walk. Some of us can do complex equations in our head, while others can't do basic math with pencil and paper. Who would hold us all to the same standard? A loving good guy who wants each and every one of us to know him? Or a supervillain looking to cull the...
Now this argument immediately supposes that God is holding us to a standard. He isn't. We couldn't possibly meet that standard. He is instead offering to make us perfect. He came to us. He didn't force us to come to him.
In the end, thankfully, the world's worst supervillain is fiction.
Then why are we talking about him?
Considerations of this particular supervillain permeate and affect our lives, from the bedroom all the way up to the Oval Office.
Oh, politics. Got it. So what have we learned? The argument is that God is the villain because he commits or commands Bible atrocities. If this is true, then it makes God unlikable, but he exists nonetheless. If it's false, then this doesn't stand as an argument against God's existence, just an argument against the Bible. But the Bible is nonetheless an internally consistent narrative. Secondly, everyone dies. It's just a matter of how and when. If an innocent dies, they presumably are not judged for evil. If an evil person dies, they are forgiven if they have asked for forgiveness, or condemned if they did not. Condemnation in this case meaning expulsion from God's presence, because those who aren't interested in God presumably don't want to be in God's presence. So the expulsion is a mutual affair. So people created God out of tribalism, right? Interestingly, the God of the Bible is more judgmental towards the tribe that worships him than he is the world around them. In fact, the Old Testament prophets actually spend a great deal of time warning the surrounding tribes of God's judgment and calling them to repentance and forgiveness. And sometimes they repent and are forgiven. Meanwhile, God uses the tribes around Israel as a means to punish Israel. The argument of tribalism doesn't follow. As for modern Christians, they are commanded to love and forgive their enemies, and that if they are not loving and forgiving towards their enemies, they are not given love nor forgiveness. So whether or not Christians and Jews act in a tribal manner, and they often do, this activity is counterindicated by Scripture. Finally, God is the villain because only a few are saved, whilst the vast majority are condemned. Firstly, unlike Thanos and the Joker and Dracula and the rest, God's mission is to save, not to destroy. Consider, God is the grounding for reality. All moral and physical laws flow from his nature. So this human tendency to fight God is like trying to fight gravity or the ocean. Gravity doesn't pull you down out of spite, and the ocean waves don't wash over you out of hatred. They are simply true to their nature. Likewise, God's holiness and perfection are who he is. Humans are incapable of the kind of perfection God's nature demands. So God lends his honor to people and takes on their shame, but one cannot forgive those who do not ask for it. This is where the argument, God didn't give me the evidence sufficient to convince me, comes in. Well, evidence is one thing, conviction is another. You can't say you weren't aware of God and his nature and his plan. You wouldn't be arguing so eloquently against it if you didn't know anything about it. So then it's a matter of conviction, right? You are not convicted. Therefore, it's a failure and not your fault. And so God is unjust to condemn you. This is sort of an argument from personal experience. You wouldn't take it for granted if a Christian said that God spoke to them and they felt God's presence and therefore they know for sure that God exists. I can only take you for your word that you aren't convinced and that you haven't intentionally rejected God and so forth. I don't doubt your lack of conviction, although I wonder why you argue with such conviction. But this isn't sufficient evidence against the existence of God.